This is the first day of this September-October, also known as Septober, 2025, 7-day sesshin. And I'm going to start off with reading from Zen Master Hakuin, author of the chant we just recited, and which we recite every day in sesshin. From the very beginning, all beings are Buddha. Like water and ice, without water, no ice. Outside us, no Buddhas. Wherever we are, whatever we're doing, whatever conditions we find ourselves in, including feeling tired, sick, grumpy, achy, bored, all of it, Buddha. How could it be otherwise? As for our text, I'm using the book, The Essential Teachings of Zen Master Hakuin, translated by Norman Waddell. And today we'll start off with Waddell's introduction, which gives some biographical and contextual background to Hakuin's teachings. I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's quite long, but I'm going to instead extract some highlights. Waddell begins by recognizing Hakuin Eikaku, who lived from 1685 to 1768, as the major figure in Japanese Rinzai Zen, what was called the Linji school in China before it took root in Japan. In introducing Hakuin, Waddell says, "During a long life spent as a country priest in a tiny rural temple, Hakuin almost single-handedly reformed and revitalized a Zen school that, except for a brief interval in the previous century, had been in a state of spiritual lethargy for nearly 300 years. In so doing, he laid the foundation for a method of Zen training that has enabled his school to continue as a spiritual force to the present day." So the state of Zen practice and training at the time was of deep concern to Hakuin. He was troubled by a number of trends that he observed. For example, there was a growing emphasis on memorizing sutras and studying at the expense of the disciplined practice of Zazen. Also, many practitioners seemed to settle for the smallest insight, upon which they adopted a rather passive or lazy attitude about ongoing practice, as if there wasn't more work to do, more delusion to uproot, more Dharma gates to open. Another thing that Hakuin was disturbed by was the decline in koan practice, which he saw as the most effective method for penetrating through delusion. And koans are effective because they help us break free of our habit of conceptualizing and rationalizing, intellectualizing everything. Planning, analyzing, calculating, problem solving. These are our usual strategies. But what happens when we let go of them? And it's in this way that koans have a way of backing you into a corner. You get to the point where you exhaust all your attempts to think your way through it. And in the process, you're confronted by the ego's persistent attempt to be in control, to be the center of attention. But here's the thing. There's no one in control. There's nothing to control. The brain's prefrontal cortex does a really good job making us believe otherwise. And that's what we have to work with. Of course, koans are not the only effective method of Zen practice. There's also counting the breath, following the breath, shikantaza. So if you're not working on a koan, it's a mistake to think that there's a problem with that. Whatever your practice is, what's most important is giving yourself fully to it and looking directly, experiencing directly. Not through the filter of thoughts. And while Hakuin's legacy is in part the revitalization of koan practice, it's not just that. He also revitalized Zazen, a rigorous practice of Zazen, and also Zen training, as we're doing here in Sesshin. Waddell goes on to say, when Hakuin died, he had redefined Zen for Japanese people in the modern era. And also, in recent years, recognition of his achievements as a painter and a calligrapher have gained him a reputation beyond the sphere of religion as one of the most versatile and original artists of the Edo period. I'm sure Many of you have seen some of his paintings. The most famous are the ones he did of Bodhidharma, this legendary, wide-eyed, bearded barbarian. He used bold brush strokes, bringing Bodhidharma to life with ink. Waddell also gets into Hakuin's influence on Zen training. He says, Hakuin's effort was to convince students that the Zen being taught in contemporary temples was false, hence ineffective, and that freedom lay in the authentic realization attained through the way of Kensho, or enlightenment. He proceeded to demonstrate using the examples of eminent Zen figures of the past, as well as the experience he had during his own long spiritual struggle, that this freedom could not be attained by anything less than total dedication to a vigorous program of practice. To put this in context, at the time, Kensho, which is an initial direct insight into one's own nature, it was largely being dismissed along with koans. So instead of that, instead of working on koans, and instead of awakening to your own true nature, what was being emphasized was trying to experience and maintain some kind of tranquil, peaceful state. But our true nature is active. It's not passive. It's dynamic. It's embodied. It moves. And that's what Zazen is, embodied awareness. And that's the case no matter what practice you happen to be working on. Ultimately, it comes down to our own effort, determination, and faith. I know from my own past experience, you can work on a koan with a very passive, kind of blank attitude, for lack of a better word. Just as you can other methods of practice. Again, falling into this kind of passive attitude. And if you treat practice as dull and boring, then that's what you're going to get. I'm reminded of a guy who used to live in the neighborhood next door to Chapin Mill. And he often was out going for walks, and he would observe people walking around on the road really slowly, their eyes down. He'd never seen anything like that before. And one day when I was chit-chatting with him, and I was telling him we were getting ready to start a retreat, he asked me, "Are you going to let the zombies out?" From the outside, from someone who doesn't know a thing about what we're up to, I could imagine that we do look like zombies walking along the road. He said it in a very friendly, playful kind of way. But how strange it was to him. And he was very curious about it. And in the end, we talked some more, and he came to really appreciate what we're doing. I'm going to skip to a section now on Hakuin's early life. Waddell says, Hakuin was born and spent his entire life, except for the years he was wandering the country on pilgrimage, in a tiny farming village situated near the foot of Mount Fuji. He was by all accounts inclined strongly toward religion at a very early age. And as a child, it's said that Hakuin's strong affinity for practice for Zen was spurred on by the fear of ending up in the hell realm. You can imagine a child having all these vivid ideas about what the hell realm is. And in Buddhist cosmology, it's distinguished by a state of intense physical and emotional pain, which is something we can all relate to and which many of us confront in sesshin. But it's not a fixed eternal state. It's transient. But in any case, Hakuin was terrified of this when he was a child and fixated on doing whatever he could to avoid it. Little did he know at the time that the very things that we try to avoid, the very things that we try to run away from, that which we reject, like pain, boredom, and so on, it ends up bringing us closer to it, even as we're trying to run away. And that's because it's a form of clinging. Clinging to any state or condition is setting yourself up for dissatisfaction. This practice teaches us to flow with conditions, flow with life as it is, not the way we want it to be, or the way we don't want it to be. Waddle goes on. At the age of 15, Hakuin entered religious life at the neighborhood Zen temple, Shoinji. The head priest who shaved Hakuin's head was a family friend. He gave the young novice the religious name Ikaku, which he would use until his 30s, when, upon being established as abbot of Shoinji himself, he adopted the additional name Hakuin. 4 years later, so that would have been at the age of 19, his teacher permitted him to set out on a pilgrimage to study with other Zen teachers around the country. Hakuin's wanderings lasted 14 years. After years of travel, seeking advice and instruction from many Zen teachers, but mostly practicing on his own, at the age of 31, he sequestered himself in a remote hermitage in the mountains, determined to make an all-out effort to attain a final breakthrough. A final breakthrough. Hakuin actually had his first kensho in his early 20s, while he was on that same pilgrimage. And this is how he described it in his autobiography, Wild Ivy. At around midnight, on the 7th and final night of my practice, the boom of a bell from a distant temple reached my ears. Suddenly, my body and mind dropped completely away. Body and mind dropping completely away. He experienced his true self as no self. As not separate from the bell, nor the temple, or anything else. But that initial kensho experience didn't lead him to slack off like many of his contemporaries. He persisted, not letting up. And it's said that in time he had multiple, both small and large, kenshos. But he said it wasn't until his early 40s that he felt he could actually integrate his realization into everyday life and truly be of service to others. To uphold and embody the Dharma. And this includes letting go of any pride in one's insight. Zen stink, as it's often called. Letting go of any and all ambition. And as for Hakuin, Waddell says that when he was still in his 20s and sitting in that mountain hermitage, news reached him that his father had fallen critically ill and wanted him to return and reside in Shoinji, which was now vacant and in need of a priest. Hakuin, somewhat reluctant, agreed. His years of pilgrimage were now at an end. The temple Hakuin had inherited was not only small and insignificant, it was also penniless, its buildings neglected, and in an advanced stage of decay. A religious biography of Hakuin, compiled by his disciple Torei, gives some idea of what it was like at the time. And here's what Torei wrote. Shoinji had fallen into an almost indescribable state of ruin. Stars shone through the roofs at night. The floors were constantly saturated by rain and dew. It was necessary for the master to wear a straw raincoat as he moved about the temple attending to his duties. He needed sandals inside the main hall when he went there to conduct ceremonies. Temple assets had passed into the hands of creditors. The temple equipment had all been pawned. Hopefully this won't ever happen to Chapin Mill or Arnold Park. But let's say that it does. That the buildings and grounds fall into a state of total disrepair. Then what? Then we sit down and do Zazen. Conditions change. But our true nature encompasses all of it. It's the eternal aspect of change. Changelessness. Waddell goes on. During his late 30s and 40s, Hakuin accepted a small but growing number of students. His reputation slowly grew and spread. By his early 50s, he composed a set of introductory talks, which established him as the foremost Zen teacher in Japan. Monks and nuns and lay people from all over began to converge on Shoinji. They came from all classes of society and all walks of life. Shoinji barely supplied its own needs. It was unable to accommodate even a small number of students, let alone the hundreds who were coming to receive instruction from Hakuin. Most of those who came were obliged to find lodging elsewhere. They slept and practiced in private houses and abandoned dwellings, unused temples and halls, ruined shrines, under the eaves of farmhouses. Some even camped out under the stars. I'm reminded during the construction process of Chapin Mill, in the early stage of it, there wasn't space really inside for people to stay. So there was at least one sesshin I did where I stayed in a tent in the millhouse field. He goes on, the whole countryside for miles around the temple was transformed into a great center for Zen practice. It was a new kind of Buddhist assembly, formed and maintained by the monks themselves. The records speak of the great awe in which Hakuin was held by his students. His disciple Torei remembered him as a sheer cliff towering abruptly before him, a menacing presence stalking the temple like a great ox, glaring around with the eyes of an angry tiger. Something of the terror Hakuin must have struck into the hearts of students can be felt by standing before the effigy sculpture of him enshrined in the Founders Hall at Shoinji. Even today, it glares formidably out at the spectator. Actually, at Arnold Park, on the wall, hanging above the Dokusan waiting line, there's a print featuring this very sculpture of Hakuin with his piercing eyes. But Waddell says Hakuin was not always the flint-eyed teacher striking terror into the hearts of Zen students. He was also a man of great warmth and kindness and humor, who shared the life of his fellow villagers and was deeply sympathetic to their needs. When he was not engaged in training his students, he was trying to reach out through writing and painting to educate the farmers, the fishermen, and others of his native region, and bring them closer to the truth of the Buddhist teaching. So there's this generous, compassionate side of Hakuin. This side of him is shown in a classic Zen story, which perhaps you've heard before, but it's worth repeating. The story goes that there was a beautiful young woman in the village, the same temple where the same village, rather, where Hakuin's temple resided. And this woman was praised highly for her beauty and her purity. But one day, she became pregnant. Her parents were outraged. They demanded to know who the father was. How could this happen to their beautiful daughter? She held back in making a confession. They kept badgering her, but she didn't confess. You can imagine being in her shoes. She was probably a teenager, really, at the time. Embarrassed, full of shame. She came from a well-to-do family. Her parents were very well known and regarded. They operated a store in the village. By becoming pregnant, she violated gender norms for appropriate behavior for women, unmarried women in particular. And she was probably afraid of the consequences for her and for her yet-to-be-born child. She was probably also afraid of what the consequences would be for the man whom she fell in love with. What would happen to him, the father of her child? But as her embarrassment and anxiety grew, she made a confession to her parents. The father was the revered Zen Master Hakuin. Naturally, her parents became even more outraged at this revelation. They went straight to Hakuin to confront him on their daughter's accusation, to which he replied, "Is that so?" Months later, when the daughter gave birth to the baby, the parents brought it to Hakuin, who at this point was viewed by all the villagers as a scoundrel. It completely tarnished his reputation. They demanded that he take care of the baby, this illegitimate child, since he was the one responsible for getting their daughter pregnant. To which Hakuin said, "Is that so?" As he calmly took the newborn into his arms, brought it home, where he fed and cared for it devotedly. For many months, he continued to care for this baby until one day, when the daughter could no longer withstand the fact that she had told a big lie. She confessed that the real father was a young man in the village who worked at the fish market, and that she was trying to protect him from the scorn of her parents and the village. The parents were shocked. They immediately went back to Hakuin to see if he would be willing to return the baby. They explained all that had happened and apologized for the incredible suffering this all must have caused him. "Is that so?" he said, as he handed over to them the child that he had been caring for. Not a trace of self. No anger over being accused of something he didn't do. No defensiveness. No concern about his image, his reputation, what others would think and say about him. No complaints about any of the sacrifices he had to make in order to care for this baby. Just doing what needed to be done. Receiving the child freely without hesitation or annoyance, taking care of it, and then giving it back freely. May we each give ourselves to our practice this same way, not resisting anything, not chasing after preferences, not distracting ourselves from how things are. But just immersing ourselves in this as it is. This one mu. this one breath. This. And this. We'll stop here and recite the 4 vows.